to our conference, our biannual conference. Actually, we did meet last April in 2019 in New Paltz, and together with the SUNY Faculty Development Community of Practice Advisory Board, we made the decision to do a conference every other year, and we decided to start in 2020. We were supposed to be at SUNY Cortland, and obviously we're not there right now, and hopefully the next conference, maybe we'll be back there or somewhere else, and probably 2022 at that point. But the purpose of the SUNY Faculty Development Community of Practice, which again is sponsoring this conference and planned it, is to bring together people who support faculty, support instruction throughout SUNY, people who direct teaching and learning centers, people who work in instructional design positions, and there's various other positions, faculty who get release time to support other faculty. And we also have faculty in our community of practice. So it really is a very inclusive community of practice. We have, I think, almost 900 people in our workplace group, and it's fairly active and it's a supportive group. And so when we put out the call for proposals, we got a lot of great proposals from that group. And if you look at the agenda on the website, which I have up now, you'll see we have a really great week planned. We try to not overwhelm. I know that you're probably all pretty zoomed out by now. So we tried to build in plenty of breaks, some time for Q&A during lunch for the posters, which I'll talk about in a second. But like I said, we've put a lot of thought and time and effort and energy in planning a sort of engaging virtual week for everyone. So, we hope and expect that it's all going to go smoothly and we're not going to have any issues. And I've been also seeing that there's a lot of engagement planned for a lot of the sessions. So it won't just be talking heads. We're going to be practicing what we preach this week, and so hopefully you'll just get some good ideas for how to do engaging sessions online and Zoom all week, in addition to the excellent content you'll get from a lot of the sessions. All right, so you may have seen, if you registered, obviously, that's why you're here, but in your registration confirmation, you saw that there are 2 links for the week. There's a link for today, and then there's a different link for Tuesday through Friday. We had to do that so that we made sure that the closed captions were going to work properly. So Michaela already mentioned, if you're just joining us, you should see the option to have live closed captioning during the session. If you just kind of go into your Zoom tools and click on show captions, you'll be able to see those captioned live. We will be recording all the sessions and then adding captions as well to them later, and posting those on the website and on our CPD YouTube page. And so once they start to get populated there, we'll let you know, and you can go and check out recordings later if you miss a session. The other thing too that we're doing differently, obviously, in a virtual conference, are posters. So if you go to the website, you'll see a list of some of the posters for the week, and they're all there are links to all of them. And what I did was I put the posters in Google Docs. And so if you click on a poster, if you want to leave a note for the person who created the poster, you can do that. It's a little bit, it's in sort of suggestion mode, so you can actually delete the whole poster. But if you do that, I'll just reject that suggestion and it'll go back to the way it was. But what you can do is you can, after you have a chance to view the poster, now it might be a little hard to see, so you might need to zoom in and see it that way. But after you have a chance to see the poster, you just go to insert, comment, and you can leave a comment for the person. Well, I blew it up, so it looks a little awkward now. So you can leave a comment. There's various ways you could do that. I'm not going to do it now, but you can insert a comment and leave a question for the poster presenter, and they can get back to you either in the Google Doc, or if you look back on the website, we do have times for each of these folks to do a Q&A during the lunchtime. So if you look at the agenda, we have about 45 minutes planned for lunch. And so the person who put together the poster is going to be there to take questions about their poster during lunchtime, and they'll be able to show it as well at that time. So I think that's all the kind of logistics for the day that I want to say now. I do want to turn over to Provost Laursen in a second just to say a few words of welcome and thank him for doing that, by the way. And And also, again, thank the SUNY Faculty Development Advisory Board who helped plan this. A few members of the advisory board will be moderating some of the sessions. Thankfully, are giving me a break here and there over the next week. And again, that's all I'm going to say for now. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat. So if anything I said isn't clear, I'll go in there and clarify it. But what I want to do is turn it over to Provost Laursen. And again, thank him for being here. Todd?
Thanks, Chris. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you. And yeah, on my walk in this morning, I was remembering the New Paltz conference last time we were able to convene, and it seems like kind of forever ago, doesn't it? There's been quite a few things that have happened since then. But you know, I do think that, you know, one of the things that really impressed me, I would say, about the New Paltz conference, and I think many of you will remember too, that at that time I was almost brand new to the system. I'd just been here a matter of months at that time, but I was really struck by the organic nature of it, in the way that it had come together and the level of support that this network was providing for each other, whether they're instructional professionals, faculty, other folks who are involved in the teaching and learning enterprise. It was just really striking to me and good to see at a system level. So glad to see that this is convened again. And I think if you look at what's happened since that time, it's really done nothing but validate, I think, the need for this sort of mutual support, given the challenges we're all facing and the level of innovation that we're trying to apply to meeting the needs of our students. But then I think, secondly, we've been able to reap the benefits of the sort of work that you all are doing together and the interconnectivity you've achieved across the system. Because when we pulled off the pivot to distance learning last spring, and, you know, I use the term pulled off loosely because we know that some parts of it worked better than others. There's just no question about that. But I also think that the level of adaptivity that faculty showed, the support they were able to provide, you know, for each other, together with instructional staff, you know, to, where necessary, learn from mistakes fairly quickly. And to better meet the needs of their students as the semester went along, you know, was really remarkable and something to see. And I think from a system point of view, you know, we view the investments we've made in groups like this, in things like the online effort, PIF funding that went into communities of practice, not only for this one, but for applied learning and for early student alerts and the vast variety of mechanisms we've tried to invest in and nurture over the years to help along the teaching and learning enterprise. I think those things really bear fruit in a time like we've been through, and in a time like that we continue to work our way through now. And it's very much a work in progress, I think, as we all know. But I was really gratified to see the list of topics. Again, I kind of have the sense that this continues to be quite organic, which I think is great, because in many respects, that's going to mean that it's driven by the needs of our students and driven by the needs of our faculty and staff trying to support them. And, you know, of course, we know that the challenges that many of our students are facing right now are just unbelievable, right? With regard to the living situations they may be in, the childcare responsibilities they may have, trying to juggle their school with work, which of course they would be doing in ordinary times, but probably not with the level of economic distress on average that I think many of our learners are facing. So, you know, it really has called, I think, for us to be receptive and responsive, you know, to those needs in media that are new for many of us. I mean, that's, I think, the other thing that sometimes goes missed in all of this discussion, that with the amount of remote and online learning that is occurring across the system now, and it's really obviously very pervasive at the moment. Roughly half of of all learning in the system, if not a little bit more than that now, is happening in remote format. But this is coming from a faculty that probably 80% or so of which prior to COVID was not customarily teaching online. So this has required some resourcefulness. It's required some support. And it's exactly, I know, the work that you all do, and I'm so grateful for it. So when I looked through the agenda today, sort of recognizing that organic nature, I think, of what this group is, and yet its responsiveness, I think, to needs that we all persist or perceive, I think there's a few things that I saw. I think obviously teaching well at scale is going to be a topic that many of us are thinking about. The online initiative is explicitly about this and trying to figure out ways to make high quality SUNY educational programs available more broadly to students who, for schedule restrictions or things going on in their lives or whatever it might be, are less able to partake of traditional modes. And so I think continuing to push that access is important. And a lot of you are thinking about that. It's not just magic that you take courses that are designed for 15 or 20 students and think about how to offer them to 4 to 5 times that many, maybe, right? And maybe it's not equally amenable to all subjects either, but there are, I think, methods out there that many of our faculty are innovators in that are developing and thinking about that, all the way from scheduling to course design to pedagogical methods. And so I think that's important. I think about things like our commitment to student success and applied learning. And, both of those are things that I think COVID and remote learning require us to think more innovatively about, maybe, and new ways of doing. I saw that some of the posters were sort of targeted at the experiential aspects, and I think that's really important. And of course, I know that there is still, particularly in the clinical professions, a lot of face-to-face still going on where it's needed. But thinking about in those courses and in those programs where maybe that face-to-face component isn't feasible, how can we foster virtual collaboration? What are some of the tools out there for doing that? What are some of the experiences and pedagogical techniques faculty have to support that? So I felt like I saw a thread of that as well through many of the topics and also the posters, which Chris discussed a few minutes ago. And then I think finally, I mentioned the economic impact earlier. And this is where I think things like the investments we've made as a system in open educational resources, or OER, and other affordability course media solutions that, different campuses are looking at different techniques for this. I think this has many attributes. I think obviously it's responsive to the economic needs that our students have, making sure that not only is access achieved, but equitable access is achieved so that folks have the materials they need to be successful in the curricula we're developing. Obviously, that's first and foremost. But I think the other thing I find about OER is that it's extremely attractive from a pedagogical standpoint too, and maybe letting faculty and the staff that they work with show their creativity and thinking of new ways of delivery of course materials. And obviously a lot of the investment we've made in OER specifically has been in course development, and it's been in faculty about developing materials that can be shared, can be used more broadly. And I think this is a great way of disseminating knowledge and techniques as well. We had kind of an interesting recent example of this in a corner of the world. My first 2 or 3 weeks of COVID were, started probably before they did for many in our system, because we were trying to figure out how to get SUNY students from Europe and Asia in particular back safely to the United States. So this would have been late February, very beginning of March. And as I think many of you know, and many of your campuses had students, and you as faculty and staff likely assisted in this, it was quite a logistical challenge to get in contact with many of those students as we could and get them back. And thankfully we were able to do that. We as a system, thanks to Brockport and Stony Brook particularly, had our first experience in running successful quarantines as well, making sure that those students were reintroduced to their homes without, contributing to the spread. All very important, right? But sort of following on that, a few weeks later, we started getting inquiries from both faculty and students. Obviously, study abroad and student mobility in the usual way is not going to resume, at least for a little while. It will resume eventually, clearly. But how do we sort of think about methods for students and faculty to be able to have international engagement and maybe include sort of an applied learning agenda at the same time? So this is where this idea of the global commons came from over the summer. And it was, I would say in large part, a collaboration between campuses. There were, if our memory serves correctly, 7 campuses that contributed faculty to this initiative. We had the COIL Center, Collaborative Online International Learning, involved with this, sort of providing the pedagogical methodology for collaboration with international partners abroad on applied learning projects, but also OER. And it turned out that the OER initiative allowed the faculty who participated in the Global Commons, it aided them in doing the development of the course materials. We'll then be able to make those more broadly available. And I think it's a nice example of how, the kind of investments we're making, this need for this type of engagement for some of our students is not going to go away. And so, okay, they can't travel to South America or to Asia or to Europe just now, but maybe there are some ways that we can continue the sort of co-design work we've done with international partners in the applied learning space and provide students ways to do that. Not saying it's a complete substitute, but it also means we don't have to fold up our tents and go home when international program and travel becomes more difficult. We innovate and we figure out new ways of doing that. So just really grateful for the work that everybody on here is doing. And I see a few remarks coming up in the chat. I think, Chris, this is probably a good place for me to stop, but happy to take any questions or comments that folks might have in the next few minutes. And again, thank you all for what you're doing. I say this to the provosts all the time. We meet especially regularly the last 6 months, you might guess. And one of the things I always share with them is I'm just in deep admiration of the work that administrators, faculty, and staff are doing across the system and responding to the challenge. And I would definitely want this group to hear the same thing. And our job here at System is to do whatever we can to be supportive, programmatically and otherwise. So thank you very much. And I wish you a successful and productive conference.
Thanks so much, Todd. I don't see, does anybody have questions for the provost? You could put it in the chat, or there's about 99 people. So if you'd like to open up your mic and be brave enough to do that, that would be cool too. I was really glad that, your highlights mentioning OER, and there's been some comments in the chat about OER. Mike Daly is reaching out to, or is going to offer some information about OER for someone that asked. And I also put a link into the Lumen circles, which if anybody's not familiar with them, check out the link in the chat. But that Lumen Learning had sort of taken over from a company called Faculty Guild to do online reflective teaching circles for faculty. And we've had hundreds of folks go through that over the last year. And we actually just met with the folks from Mike Daly and I, with the folks from Lumen last week, and so far so good. And we're going to have a few more of those, and we'll be publicizing them soon. So it's a really great opportunity for faculty to have meaningful online engagement with other faculty, not just in SUNY, but nationally. And so I'm glad you mentioned OER, and that, and what struck me most about when you were talking is that, we really were, I think, well positioned to respond to the pandemic with the OER initiative, with the SUNY Online initiative, and with SUNY Coil. I mean, all these kind of, virtual, initiatives we've had going on, online initiatives that, and a lot of the people that are here are the ones that put a lot of time, years into making sure that those things
That's
were
right.
working well. So,
That's right.
yeah. Any questions for the provost? Uh, Someone's asking, when, in his opinion, can we return to face-to-face operations? That is the
Well,
million-dollar question.
yeah, that is. Well, we're in the process now of working with the provost and the presidents to think about what spring semester is going to look like. And I think it's reasonable to expect for the spring, at least, that um, it's going to be a mix. I think the one thing we as a system have figured out over the course of this semester, and thank goodness for our colleagues at Upstate, that's all I can say with regard to the testing capability that we have now. But we've been able to kind of figure out, I think, the role of good surveillance practices on campuses and how to do testing in a, I think financial officers across the system would disagree, but at least in an as affordable a way as possible to try to keep everybody, safe and screened. And that, of course, directly translates to the educational mode we're operating in, right? Because we have to reduce density. The more we reduce density from a public health standpoint, the easier our job becomes with regard to controlling the spread. I think the good news, and I should definitely touch wood on this, but we're not seeing significant evidence really anywhere that the spread is contributed to significantly by in-class activities. And I'm not saying it's not possible. It of course is. The precautions that we're taking are really important. But most of the spread, I think, has been well documented, is occurring in off-campus settings and on-campus settings, I should say. It's groups congregating for parties, for events that maybe shouldn't happen, or at least shouldn't happen without proper distancing and masking. And then, of course, if you look at the southern tier the last couple of weeks, much of that spread really came from the community, actually, right? And obviously many of our campuses, Binghamton included, are inseparable from their communities. So what becomes a community issue becomes a campus issue, and vice versa. So, I mean, all of this to say, I think we have to continue to be mindful, particularly for the spring, that the face-to-face we do is very carefully provisioned and planned, and that we take the safety measures we need. I think truthfully, beyond the spring semester, a lot is going to depend on the vaccine. And I think how that plays out in the next few weeks and months is really going to be critical as to what that longer term situation is going to be. But I'm feeling quite a bit better now than I was a few weeks ago, at least about our collective ability to do the surveillance testing we need to do, and then respond when we see an incidence on a campus. And we just need to continue to be vigilant. And yeah, it's the other thing too, right? If you look across the country, usually bad things happen when folks let down their guard just a little, right? And so I think for all of us, I just made a comment about there's limited evidence of the spread occurring during the classroom activities. That's true. But at the same time, we don't want to be sloppy about that. So it's going to be a little while, I think, is the short answer. And I see something in the chat about an official announcement. End of the month for sure. Some campuses are already, getting out there with a little bit of information, but the chancellor and I and the rest of the leadership team were on with all the presidents last week. We've got their comments back on the guidance. We're working through the next draft now. So we will be getting this out before the end of this month, which is late, and we know that, but of course the situation's been evolving too. So really trying to make sure we get this right.
And Todd, there was a follow-up question that she asked, is there a difference between the commuter colleges, like community colleges and some of the others that are more commuter and those that are residential?
Yeah, there is, and a lot of the differences. I mean, just to maybe take one, the easy one is the stuff we tend to obsess over, which is the timing of the spring semester and whether there are going to be spring breaks or not. And I know these have implications, but we've been able to fairly efficiently work through some of those questions. I think the stickier ones and where this question really applies have to do with what needs to happen at the end of fall semester in terms of sending people home, and being sure that they're not carrying the disease with them when they go home at the end of the semester. And then, when folks come back for the spring, what does that sort of reentry testing protocol look like? And I think for both of those, the testing regimens and the quarantine regimens are going to depend a little bit on whether we're talking about residential students or commuter students. And that's not to say for commuter students there won't be anything. There will be something. There are at least going to be, statistical sampling of those populations, but it's obviously a little bit of a different question. It's also a little different, and maybe this is the heart of the question, if we're talking about a community college vis-a-vis a youth center, right? In terms of where students are coming from, where they're going to go home to for Thanksgiving, and what those protocols should be. So those are the things that we're working through with the presidents right now, and should have that out shortly.
There was another question sent to me privately, but I think it's a really good one to maybe kind of finish out the time with you. And that is, what do you see us building on in terms of what has happened over the last, 7, 8 months? Like, what innovations have you seen that you think, wow, this is actually the silver lining in what's been a really challenging time for everybody?
Yeah, well, I think there's a few. I mean, if we were sitting here a year ago and I were looking at, say, the SUNY Online initiative, I would say, wow, this is a little bit worrisome that only 20% or so of our faculty are engaging in this form of education, if there's going to be a large demand for this among students, right? Well, clearly that's not the case now, and I'm not saying that online and remote are the same. I understand the difference, but I think that 80% or so of SUNY faculty, have significantly more experience with at least some of the tools that are used to achieve, quality remote and online education than they did before. And that feels like an opportunity. I know for me, as somebody who, would like to get to be a faculty member a little more often than I do these days, there's a little bit of an intimidation factor with some of these things if you haven't done it and you sort of have your traditional toolbox that you're used to using. So I think that familiarity is one, and ability maybe to, yeah, okay, if not fully online, maybe there's some potential for innovation and hybrid approaches that will be facilitated by a larger number of people. The second thing I would say is the connectivity with students. And, our faculty have really had to be pretty creative, because a lot of their usual tricks for staying in touch with their students and, making sure that they were collaborating with each other in an effective way and that they were in a position to mentor them, those habits had to change, right? And I think many of our faculty, most of our faculty, one way or the other, have figured out ways to do that. Again, not saying they're created equal, but I think, higher education will change, it will shift. And I think I see it somehow for us as a collective of the faculty. I think some of these habits we've developed during COVID are probably healthy habits for us going forward.
Well, we're just past 9:30, so we have to transition to the next session. But I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to everybody. And hopefully in 2 years, when we're back in a face-to-face environment, you'll join us again. And if you have a chance to stick around for some of these talks, that would be great as well. But a round of applause, everyone could.
Would be happy to. Thank you, Chris, and
All
thank
right.
you all for
Th-
everything you're doing.
Thank you so much, Todd. All right.
Pleasure to be with you.
Yes. So we're going to transition now over to our next session. Everyone go get a little coffee. You have about 13 minutes till the next session on strategies for teaching a large enrollment course. And we're going to get Rose and Linda up as co-hosts now so they can share their screen and do all that kind of stuff. So good to see everybody. And, feel free to have discussions in the chat during the break, just like you would at the waiting for coffee if we were live face to face. So